You're listening to the Valley Current.
Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there is this expectation of precision, you know?
Right, yeah.
Like you break your arm, the x-ray shows a jagged white line, the doctor points to it, and well, that is it. Broken or not broken.
Exactly. It is a binary thing.
Yeah, it is clean, it is visible, and frankly, it is comforting because we know exactly what we're dealing with. But the moment you step into the world of international warfare and high-stakes diplomacy, that X-ray machine just shatters. We are left looking at a diagnostic landscape that is entirely murky.
Which is, that is exactly why the anxiety level globally is where it is today.
Oh, absolutely.
You cannot just point to a single line on a map or a single signed document and say, there is the peace or there is the war.
Yeah.
It is all gray area right now.
So today is April 8, 2026. And the world is currently sitting on a razor's edge. Our mission for you today on this deep dive is to decode an exclusive, really highly detailed, special geopolitical report.
And it is a fascinating one, yeah.
It is. It is from the Foundation for Creativity and Dispute Resolution, the FFCDR, and it is authored by their CEO, Jack Russo.
Right.
So we are going to be looking past the political rhetoric to examine the actual leverage points, the hidden flexibilities, and the intense diplomatic chess moves happening right now in Islamabad regarding Operation Epic Fury.
Because we have these two competing peace plans, right? And this impending 2-week deadline with basically the fate of the global economy hanging in the balance.
Yeah. Okay, so let's unpack this. We have to look at how we even got here.
Well, I think in a world of information overload, understanding the mechanics of this ceasefire is critical, not just for global security, but for understanding how modern conflicts actually end.
Because they do not end the way they do in movies.
Exactly. They do not just end with a bad guy waving a white flag on a battlefield. It is so much more complicated.
Right. But before we go any further, I want to be crystal clear with you, the listener. We are going to be analyzing actions, statements, and demands from some, highly polarizing political figures across the global spectrum.
Oh, yeah. Very polarized.
Like Donald Trump, Benjamin Netanyahu, the supreme leadership of Iran. So I need to say up front, we take absolutely no political sides here.
Right. Not at all.
Our goal is not to endorse or condemn any viewpoint. We are strictly and impartially reporting the contents of the FFCDR document to convey the raw facts and the realities of the situation on the ground.
And that neutrality is really the only way to actually see the machinery work. If you get caught up in the partisan framing, you just miss the mechanical gears of the diplomacy that are turning right beneath the surface.
So to grasp the gravity of this moment, I want you to imagine the sheer whiplash of the last 40 days.
Right.
Because let's look at the timeline. Operation Epic Fury launched on February 28th, 2026. And the irony here is almost difficult to process. It launched on the exact same morning that a diplomatic breakthrough was actually being announced in Geneva.
Yeah, that timing just highlights a massive disconnect between the diplomatic core and the military apparatus.
Totally.
You have negotiators in Switzerland believing they have secured a mediated pause, while the military reality of a massive strike just overtakes them completely.
Right, they were literally blindsided.
It shows how quickly control can slip from the people sitting in boardrooms to the people sitting in command centers.
And it did not just escalate slowly, It started with an immediate, massive decapitation strike. Supreme leader Ali Khamenei was killed in central Tehran.
Which is huge.
It is unprecedented. And then by March 8th, the Assembly of Experts, which, just for context for the listener, is a clerical body responsible for appointing the supreme leader, they elected his son, Mojtaba Khamenei.
Right.
But Mojtaba has essentially vanished from public view since that day.
And that absence creates a terrifying variable for the negotiators. Well, when the absolute ultimate authority of a nation goes underground during an existential crisis, the diplomatic back channels lose their guarantee of follow-through.
Oh, I see. Because you do not know who is actually giving the orders.
Exactly. The state starts running on a kind of military autopilot. It becomes decentralized and highly reactive.
Wow. Let's talk about the scale of that reaction, because the FFCDR report cites CEMTCOM figures stating that over 12,300 targets were struck.
Yeah, the scale is just staggering.
12,300 targets. And the retaliation from Iran was immediate and aimed directly at the jugular of global commerce, right? They closed the Strait of Hormuz.
Which is their trump card, economically speaking.
Right. That single maritime choke point handles roughly a fifth of the world's oil consumption. So closing it blocked 15 million barrels per day of crude oil from reaching the market.
Yeah.
We saw West Texas Intermediate WTI crude, the U.S. benchmark spike from $67 a barrel pre-war to an agonizing $117 a barrel.
And that economic reality of that spike, that is the invisible engine driving this sudden push for peace.
Because it hits everyone.
Exactly. When 15 million barrels a day get trapped in the Gulf, it is not just a problem for commodities traders in Wall Street. It is a massive regressive tax on every single listener tuning in right now.
Right, because that $117 barrel means the diesel powering the entire supply chain suddenly costs a fortune.
Yep.
It means the price of getting groceries to your local supermarket just skyrockets.
And that economic pressure cooker, it reached its boiling point on April 7th.
Right, just a day ago.
Yeah. President Trump posted a stark public warning. He wrote, "A whole civilization will die tonight," directly threatening to obliterate Iran's civilian power grid by an 8 p.m. deadline.
Which is just, apocalyptic language.
It is. But then, an absolute pivot. Just 90 minutes before that 8 p.m. deadline, a 2-week ceasefire was brokered by Pakistan.
Wait, Pakistan stepped in?
Yes, specifically Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif and Field Marshal Asim Munir.
Okay, so it is less like a game of chicken and more like two massive rival businesses engaging in a scorched earth price war.
That is a great analogy, yeah.
Like, they keep slashing prices to bleed the other out until 90 minutes before the banks close, they both simultaneously realize they will not be able to make payroll tomorrow.
Right, the math forced the stop, not a sudden wave of goodwill.
Exactly. The cost of fighting finally outweighed the cost of stopping. But my question is, did they actually stop, or are they just coasting toward a cliff?
That is the big question.
Because this miracle ceasefire is not a permanent resolution, you know? It is a pause button with a rapidly depleting battery.
And the battery life is literally measured in days. The FSCDR report maps out the compressive pressure of two very specific, very unforgiving clocks ticking down right now.
Right, so clock number 1 is April 21st. That is when this 2-week ceasefire expires.
Right.
If the diplomatic talks currently happening in Islamabad fail to produce a framework or an extension, the threat to destroy Iran's power plants and bridges presumably goes right back into effect.
Yeah, that is the external military cliff. But the second clock is domestic to the United States. And historically, domestic law can be far less flexible than international diplomacy.
So clock number 2, April 29th. The War Powers Resolution's 60-day deadline.
This is where it gets really complicated.
Yeah, let me give a quick primer for anyone who isn't deep into U.S. constitutional law. The War Powers Resolution of 1973, specifically under Title 50, Section 1544 of the U.S. Code, it dictates that the president needs congressional authorization 60 days after hostilities begin.
Right.
Since this conflict began on February 28th, that 60-day mark hits on April 29th. So if Congress has not explicitly authorized the war by that date, the president is legally required to begin withdrawing U.S. forces from hostilities.
And the legal jeopardy here is astonishing, because legally speaking, a ceasefire does not pause the war powers clock.
Wait, really? A ceasefire doesn't stop the countdown?
No, it does not. A temporary pause in the shooting does not equal statutory authorization from the United States Congress. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the FSCDR report highlights a piece of analysis from Paul D. Miller in the Dispatch, and he lays it out brutally. He says the administration has until April 29th to get congressional authorization, or until May 29th to completely withdraw U.S. forces from combat operations.
But consider the legislative calendar here. The report notes that Congress is on recess and is not scheduled to return until April 28th.
1 day before the clock runs out.
1 day. That means even if the diplomats in Islamabad pull off a miraculous agreement by April 21st, the U.S. domestic constitutional clock could still unravel the whole thing just 8 days later.
That recess gap is the ultimate pressure point. I mean, if hostilities resume between the expiration of the ceasefire on April 21st and the expiration of the war powers clock on April 29th, it forces an immediate constitutional crisis in Washington.
Yeah, you would have an active, major regional war waging simultaneously with a legal mandate to withdraw.
Exactly. And the administration's leverage in Washington isn't just about legal statutes. You know, it is about cold, hard cash.
Right, the funding.
There is a $200 billion supplemental appropriations request pending to fund these operations. Congress's true leverage is the purse strings.
So every dollar of that $200 billion requires a vote.
Right. If the administration wants that funding, they cannot present Congress with an unauthorized, resumed war on April 29th. They have to present a viable diplomatic framework.
Which forces the two sides in Islamabad to find common ground immediately. They have to agree on something tangible to present to their respective capitals.
But when you actually read the proposals sitting on the table in Islamabad, finding common ground looks mathematically impossible.
Yeah, let's talk about those proposals. We have Iran's 10-point plan, which was published via Pakistani intermediaries on April 6th, and the U.S. 15-point plan delivered around March 25th.
Right.
If you read them back to back, they are not just in different ballparks. They are playing entirely different sports.
They are maximalist documents. I mean, they are designed to anchor the negotiation at the absolute extremes.
Let's group Iran's demands to understand the logic behind them. On the security and regime survival front, they're demanding a binding non-aggression guarantee from the U.S. and the total withdrawal of U.S. combat forces from the region.
A huge ask.
Huge. Economically, they want the removal of all U.S. primary and secondary sanctions, full payment of war damages, and sovereign control over the Strait of Hormuz.
Right.
And on the nuclear front, they demand the termination of all UN Security Council and IAEA resolutions.
It is a demand for the total dismantling of the international containment architecture that has literally encircled Iran for decades.
Yeah.
They are asking the U.S. to essentially erase 20 years of foreign policy overnight. Furthermore, Point 10 demands an all-front ceasefire, explicitly wrapping Hezbollah in Lebanon and the Houthis in Yemen into this bilateral U.S.-Iran negotiation.
Right, which makes it infinitely more complicated. And then I look at the U.S. 15-point plan, and it demands exactly the inverse.
Completely the opposite, yeah.
Yeah. The U.S. wants a 30-day ceasefire to dictate terms. They demand the complete physical dismantling of Iran's major nuclear facilities at Natanz, Isfahan, and Fordow.
Right.
They want a permanent commitment to zero nuclear weapons, zero uranium enrichment on Iranian soil, and full unrestricted access for the IAEA, the UN's nuclear watchdog.
And it goes further. The U.S. also demands the abandonment of all proxy forces, strict limits on Iran's ballistic missile program, keeping the Strait of Hormuz permanently open as an international corridor, and a formal public acknowledgement of Israel's right to exist.
To any observer, that U.S. plan is basically a demand for unconditional surrender.
It really reads like one.
But the U.S. plan does include 3 very specific concessions if Iran complies. They offer to lift the economic sanctions, provide free fuel for Iran's civilian nuclear power plant at Bushehr, and permanently disable the UN snapback mechanism.
Now, that last concession is massive.
Can you explain the snapback for the listener?
Sure. The UN snapback mechanism is basically a legal tripwire written into international agreements. It allows any single party to the agreement to instantly reinstate all previous United Nations sanctions if they feel Iran has violated the deal.
Oh, so they can bypass the vetoes.
Exactly. The report flags that this demand is stated very clearly in the Farsi language version of the plan published domestically. But it is mysteriously absent from the English language version circulating among Western diplomats.
A U.S. nuclear expert actually confirmed this deliberate omission on April 7th. It is a brilliant, cynical diplomatic maneuver.
It really is.
The Iranian leadership can point to the Farsi text and tell their domestic base, "We stood firm. We did not surrender our sovereign right to nuclear technology." But by leaving it out of the English translation, they send a silent flare to Washington and Islamabad saying, "We actually have flexibility here. This is negotiable."
Yeah, the public posturing is incredibly theatrical. I mean, the day the U.S. plan was delivered, an Iranian diplomatic source immediately dismissed it by calling it not beautiful, even on paper.
That is some top-tier diplomatic shade being thrown while actual ballistic missiles are still flying.
Yeah. And the U.S. rhetoric is just as absolute, President Trump publicly stated on April 8th that there will be absolutely no enrichment allowed, vowing to dig up and remove all of the deeply buried nuclear dust.
But the nuance there is staggering when you look at the private reality the FFCDR report uncovers. Contrast the public dig up the dust rhetoric with an internal, earlier version of the U.S. plan that reportedly allowed for limited enrichment until a regional consortium facility becomes operational.
That internal draft represents a massive softening of the public red line.
Completely.
It shows that the absolute demands broadcast on television are not the actual boundaries of the negotiation.
The report also cites U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff speaking at a private gathering, declaring that any deal can have no sunset clauses. His exact words were, "You have to behave for the rest of your lives."
Wow.
Yeah, so you have these sweeping, non-negotiable public statements masking deep, highly technical, private flexibility, which is why the FFCDR report performs what they call a gap analysis.
Right, to find the middle ground.
Exactly. It takes this mountain of demands and categorizes them into hard, medium, and bridgeable issues to find the actual path forward.
And that gap analysis is the roadmap for survival. It acknowledges that you cannot solve everything in 2 weeks, so you have to isolate the issues that can be solved through creative wording.
Let's start with the medium and bridgeable issues, because this is where the linguistic gymnastics really happen.
Absolutely.
This tier includes sanctions relief, IAEA access, the presence of U.S. regional forces, the Strait of Hormuz transit rules, and reparations. The report outlines how you basically solve these massive historical grievances through strategic rebranding.
Rebranding is the lifeblood of diplomacy. Take point 8 of Iran's plan, for example, the demand for full payment of war damages and reparations.
There is a 0% chance the United States Congress authorizes a multi-billion-dollar war damages payment to Iran.
Right, it is domestically toxic.
Any politician who votes for that just loses their job immediately.
But the money actually already exists, and it doesn't require new taxpayer funds.
Wait, what money?
The U.S. currently exercises control over more than $6 billion in frozen Iranian assets, sitting in banks in places like South Korea and Qatar.
Oh, right. Because of the complex web of secondary sanctions, international banks won't move that money without explicit U.S. Treasury approval, essentially freezing it in place.
Exactly. So the diplomatic workaround is to authorize the unfreezing of those existing assets, but carefully restrict and label the transfer. You publicly call it a reconstruction investment fund or an infrastructure rebuilding cooperation mechanism.
So basically, it is a giant exercise in rebranding.
Pretty much.
It's like paying a lawsuit settlement, but insisting on calling it a charitable donation for community development so you don't have to admit fault.
The mechanics are identical. Iran gets the desperately needed capital to rebuild their power grid, allowing the leadership to claim victory on reparations to their citizens. Meanwhile, the U.S. administration can tell Congress, we did not pay reparations. We simply released their own funds for humanitarian reconstruction under strict oversight.
Wow. The report highlights the same linguistic loophole being applied to point 9. Iran's demand for the withdrawal of U.S. combat forces from regional bases. Iran deliberately left the term combat forces undefined in the text.
And that lack of definition is an open invitation to negotiate.
Oh, so?
Well, if they define combat forces as any American in a military uniform, the negotiation would be over. By leaving it vague, it allows the United States to restructure its posture without fully abandoning the Middle East.
Okay, I see. So the U.S. could simply reclassify specific forward-deployed bases as like joint-use logistical facilities or training-only centers.
Exactly.
They rotate out the offensive strike squadrons, the F-35s or the bomber groups, which satisfies Iran's demand that combat forces have left. But the U.S. maintains the radar installations, the supply depots, and the strategic infrastructure.
It allows both sides to declare a strategic victory to their domestic audiences. And we see this exact dynamic applied to the bridgeable issue of the Strait of Hormuz. Iran demands the strait be under the coordination of the armed forces of Iran, framing it as a sovereign right. But the U.S. demands it remain a free, unhindered international maritime corridor.
The solution here isn't linguistic, though. It is delegating the problem to a trusted third party. The report points to Oman. Oman literally just stepped in to coordinate the maritime protocol to secure this 2-week ceasefire.
And Oman shares control of the Musandam Peninsula, which overlooks the strait, making them a natural geographic partner.
Right.
By establishing a formalized joint Omani-Iranian maritime protocol, perhaps involving a shared transit notification system or a minor internationally recognized transit fee, you bridge the gap. Iran gets to project sovereign oversight by partnering with Oman, and the U.S. gets the guarantee of safe, predictable commercial shipping because Oman is a trusted arbiter.
So money and semantics can patch over the medium issues. You can rebrand frozen assets, you can reclassify a military base, and you can delegate a shipping lane. But the FFCDR report draws a very hard line when it comes to the hard issues. You cannot rebrand a proxy war, and you cannot rebrand weapons-grade uranium. This brings us to the physical reality on the ground. The invisible dust and the Lebanon spoiler.
This is where the abstract world of diplomacy crashes into the hard physics of nuclear material and the human toll of regional warfare.
Let's dig into the nuclear status, because the numbers here are, frankly, terrifying. The IAEA has been locked out of Iran's nuclear facilities since June 2025.
Almost a year.
Yeah, they have had no cameras, no inspectors, no verification for nearly a year. According to the data in the FFCDR report, Iran currently holds an estimated 440 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60%.
I want to pause on that 60% figure because it is vital to understand the physics of uranium enrichment here.
Okay.
Natural uranium is mostly U-238 with less than 1% of the fissile U-235. Civilian nuclear power plants run on uranium enriched to about 3 to 5%.
Right.
To get from natural uranium to 5% requires massive industrial effort, thousands of centrifuges spinning for a long time. But once you have reached 60%, you have already done about 95% of the required isotopic separation work. The leap from 60% to 90% weapons-grade material is technically very short and very fast.
And 440 kilograms at 60%. Experts calculate that if further enriched to 90%, that is enough fissile material for upwards of 10 nuclear warheads.
And the most chilling detail in the entire FFCDR report is that despite CANTCOM unleashing that massive 12,300 target bombing campaign across Iran, that nuclear material remains completely intact.
Wait, really? After 12,000 strikes?
Yes.
The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists suggests the Iranians likely moved the most critical cascades and the 60% stockpile into deeply buried, hardened underground facilities in Isfahan well before the February 28th strikes even began.
Right.
Furthermore, U.S. intelligence estimates that even after all this bombardment, Iran still retains roughly 50% of its vast ballistic missile and drone capabilities.
This raises an important question for the diplomats in Islamabad. How do you negotiate the verifiable destruction of a nuclear stockpile that you can no longer physically locate and that you clearly cannot destroy from the air?
Because you cannot just keep dropping bunker busters if you do not know exactly which mountain it's hidden under.
Exactly. IAEA Director General Rafael Grossi issued a very sobering reality check in mid-March. He pointed out that while the visible above-ground infrastructure, the cooling towers, the power lines, the administrative buildings might be enormously degraded, the actual nuclear material is still there.
Right.
And more importantly, the scientific knowledge inside the heads of the Iranian physicists is still there. You cannot bomb knowledge out of existence.
So what is the mechanical solution to 440 kilograms of invisible 60% enriched uranium? The U.S. wants it shipped out of the country like they did under the 2015 JCPOA framework, sending it to Russia.
But the geopolitical landscape has completely shifted since 2015. Iran will absolutely not agree to surrender their sovereign property by shipping it abroad today. They view that as a total capitulation. The only technically and politically viable solution the FFCDR report identifies is in-place dilution.
What does that mean practically?
Under strict, restored IAEA supervision, the Iranian scientists themselves must chemically blend that 440 kilogram stockpile of 60% uranium back down to below 5%.
Oh, so they neutralize the threat inside their own borders.
Correct. It physically removes the weapons-grade breakout threat, but politically, it allows Iran to keep the resulting low-enriched material for their civilian power grid.
Yeah.
It is the ultimate face-saving technical compromise.
But the idea of peacefully diluting uranium in a bunker completely ignores the fact that you cannot dilute a proxy war. And right now, there is a massive one happening right next door. Let's look at the Lebanon spoiler.
Yeah, this is huge.
Point 10 of Iran's plan demands a comprehensive all-front cessation of hostilities. They insist that any bilateral agreement must also cover Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, and the proxy militias in Iraq.
The regional interconnectivity of Iran's defense strategy becomes a massive liability for achieving a quick peace. Iran views these proxy groups not as separate entities, but as their forward defense line.
But while the U.S., Pakistan, and Iran are desperately trying to negotiate a ceasefire in Islamabad, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has explicitly and publicly excluded Lebanon from the ceasefire framework.
Right.
On April 8th, the exact same day this report is analyzing, Israel launched an entirely new offensive into Lebanon dubbed Operation Eternal Darkness. They killed over 254 people in a single day.
Think about the immense psychological and political pressure that single event places on the negotiators sitting in Pakistan.
I mean, put yourself in the shoes of the Iranian delegation for a second. You are sitting in Islamabad. The Americans and the Pakistanis are sliding a piece of paper across the table telling you, we have a deal, we have a ceasefire. But at the exact same moment, your most crucial regional ally, Hezbollah in Lebanon, is currently undergoing the heaviest bombardment of the entire war. If you sign that paper, you are essentially abandoning your proxy network while they are under fire. How do you justify that to your hardline military commanders back in Tehran?
You almost cannot. It threatens to fracture the regime internally. which is why the human toll of this conflict isn't just a tragic statistic. It is an active, ongoing barrier to diplomacy.
Yeah.
Every new casualty hardens the political resolve to not surrender.
And the casualty figures cited in the report are devastating. The fog of war makes exact counting difficult, obviously, but the Iranian Health Ministry reports over 26,500 wounded.
That is a staggering number.
Fatalities are deeply contested. They range from independent trackers counting around 3,500 up to potentially 4,700 security forces killed. The U.S. has officially suffered 13 dead and over 373 wounded.
Right.
Israel reports over 26 killed with over 7,100 wounded, according to Al Jazeera trackers. And Lebanon had almost 1,500 killed before this new April 8th operation even began.
And it isn't just the combatants or the immediate civilian casualties. The destruction of civilian infrastructure creates a generational crisis. UNICEF is reporting that over 760 schools have been destroyed and 442 health facilities heavily damaged, directly affecting 10 million people across the region.
But the blast radius of this conflict extends far beyond the Middle East. The UN's World Food Program issued a staggering projection.
Yeah, this part of the report is terrifying.
They estimate that if this war continues, and if the Strait of Hormuz remains blocked, keeping oil prices pinned above $100 a barrel past mid-2026, it could push an additional 45 million people globally into acute hunger.
We have to unpack the mechanics of that WFP projection. How does a war in the Persian Gulf cause starvation in sub-Saharan Africa or South America?
Right, how does that connect?
It is the oil. When oil stays above $100 a barrel, the cost of agricultural inputs like petroleum-based fertilizers skyrockets. The cost of diesel to run the tractors skyrockets. The maritime shipping costs to transport the grain across the ocean triple. For developing nations operating on razor-thin budgets, that imported inflation completely shatters their ability to feed their populations. The local conflict in the Gulf acts as a giant vacuum, sucking economic stability out of the developing world.
Because the blast radius is global, there is a massive cast of global characters trying to either fix this crisis, manage it, or leverage it for their own strategic gains. The negotiation in Islamabad isn't a simple two-player game between Washington and Tehran.
No, it is a multi-dimensional chessboard where half the players aren't even sitting at the table, but they are absolutely moving the pieces.
Let's walk through this global cast of characters. The primary mediator, the host of the April 10th and 11th talks, is Pakistan. You have Iran's delegation led by Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Khalibaf and the U.S. delegation led by Vice President J.D. Vance.
Right.
There is a deeply revealing detail in the FFCDR report about this dynamic. Iran reportedly communicated a strong preference for dealing directly with Vice President Vance over the U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff.
That preference tells you everything about how Iran is calculating U.S. domestic politics.
How so?
Well, Witkoff is the envoy who made the hardline comment about Iran needing to behave for the rest of their lives. He represents ideological permanence. The Iranians likely view Vice President Vance as someone with direct executive authority who is fundamentally driven by a pragmatist, America First agenda.
I see.
They are betting that Vance is more interested in extracting the U.S. from a costly, inflationary foreign entanglement to focus on domestic priorities than he is in enforcing specialized ideological red lines.
That makes total sense.
And Pakistan is the indispensable channel here because they're the only nuclear-armed Muslim nation that maintains deep, complex, and credible ties with both the Pentagon and Tehran.
Then you have the critical back channels. We mentioned Oman handling the highly technical Hormuz Maritime Transit Protocol.
Right.
The report includes an almost tragic detail about the Omani foreign minister. When the war suddenly started on February 28th, right over the top of his mediation efforts in Geneva, he publicly expressed deep dismay.
Understandably so.
But despite the betrayal of that moment, the Omanis immediately swallowed their pride and went right back to work drafting the Hormuz Protocol.
That is the essence of actual diplomacy. It is entirely unglamorous. It is the work of quietly sweeping the floor while the house is actively burning down, hoping you can clear just enough debris to open the front door before the roof collapses.
That is a great way to put it. You also have the regional troika, Turkey, Egypt, and Qatar. They previously drafted a framework called the Islamabad Accord, which both sides initially rejected.
Wrong.
But Qatar's role right now is absolutely vital, specifically for attempting to mediate the situation in Lebanon to satisfy Iran's all-fronts demand.
And we cannot ignore the E3, the European powers and the Gulf states, because their actions shatter the narrative that this is purely an Iran versus U.S. and Israel conflict.
Yeah, the UK authorized the limited use of its regional bases for defensive purposes, like striking incoming missile depots, but they explicitly barred the U.S. from using those bases for offensive strikes against Iranian territory.
Because the Europeans are terrified of regional escalation.
The Gulf dynamics are even more fractured. The UAE actually took the drastic step of recalling its ambassador from Tehran and closing its embassy after stray or targeted Iranian missiles struck UAE territory during the initial exchanges.
The Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, Qatar, they're the ones physically sitting in the crossfire. They were hit by the fallout. They are quietly demanding that any peace settlement brokered by the U.S. must permanently address their security concerns regarding Iran's proxy networks and ballistic missile threats. They don't just want to pause, they want structural disarmament.
But the FFCDR report explicitly labels one actor as the spoiler in this diplomatic ecosystem, and that is Israel.
Yes.
Prime Minister Netanyahu is pursuing independent military objectives in Lebanon, publicly calling the U.S.-backed ceasefire not the end of the war, and stating that all Israeli goals will be achieved. Meanwhile, the Israeli domestic political opposition is tearing into the government, calling the U.S. diplomatic maneuvering the worst diplomatic disaster in Israel's history.
We need to be very precise about what the term spoiler means in international relations theory, though.
Okay, clarify that.
Labeling Israel a spoiler in the FFCDR context does not mean they are a rogue actor acting irrationally. It means that Israel's rational, strategic survival goals, specifically degrading Hezbollah's military infrastructure on their northern border, currently run directly counter to the United States' primary goal of a rapid, comprehensive ceasefire with Iran.
Right, their goals just do not align right now.
Israel sees a generational opportunity to dismantle a proxy threat while Iran's leadership is in chaos and their military is degraded. The U.S., however, sees a ticking constitutional war powers clock and an impending global economic meltdown. Those two timelines and sets of priorities are fundamentally misaligned.
So what does this all mean? We have all the pieces on the board. We know the players. We know the unforgiving deadlines of April 21st and April 29th. We understand the physical reality of the invisible uranium and the linguistic loopholes required to rebrand reparations. What is the actual mechanical step-by-step roadmap to get out of this alive?
The FFCDR report doesn't rely on hope. It provides a highly specific phase recommendation to thread this impossibly small needle.
Yeah.
And it requires breaking the problem down so you don't have to solve everything at once.
Okay, so phase one is the immediate crisis management. This has to happen by April 21st to stop the bombing from resuming. The goal isn't a grand peace treaty. It is simply to extend the ceasefire.
Right.
According to the report, this requires 4 distinct actions to happen simultaneously. First, the formal implementation of the Omani co-management protocol in the Strait of Hormuz to keep the oil flowing and calm the markets. Second, an IAEA-supervised freeze on the uranium stockpile, meaning no new enrichment, no movement of centrifuges, just freezing the current physical state.
Just a hard freeze.
Exactly. Third, launching a parallel Qatar-mediated negotiation track specifically for Lebanon to address Iran's demand for an all-fronts resolution. And fourth, a mutual non-escalation pledge regarding strikes.
The brilliance of phase one is what it explicitly excludes. There is no grand bargain. There is no final resolution of the nuclear program, no lifting of primary sanctions, no definition of combat forces.
Right.
Phase one is purely a tourniquet. It's about stopping the bleeding before the April 21st deadline forces the military to resume targeting the power grid.
I look at that list, though, and I have to challenge the viability of phase one. They have exactly 13 days from the date of this report to set up an entirely separate, complex, parallel peace negotiation for Lebanon, mediated by Qatar, just to keep the bilateral Iran-U.S. negotiation from collapsing. Is that even practically possible in less than 2 weeks, while Israel is actively expanding operations in Lebanon?
Practically. It is borderline miraculous if they manage to orchestrate it, but it is the only mechanical way to bypass point 10 of Iran's maximalist demand.
Oh, because they have to show something for Lebanon?
Exactly. If you cannot physically guarantee a ceasefire in Lebanon today, you have to at least guarantee a highly credible, internationally backed process toward one. Qatar is the only state actor with enough leverage over the various factions to set up that table quickly enough to satisfy Tehran's need to show they haven't abandoned their allies.
Okay, assuming they pull off that miracle and phase 1 works, the clock immediately resets. We move to phase 2, which the report states must be finalized within 14 days of extending the ceasefire. This is the nuclear framework.
Right.
And this is where the diplomacy gets highly technical and heavily reliant on that Farsi versus English translation discrepancy we talked about earlier. The report states the final agreement must acknowledge that Iran won't publicly surrender the theoretical right to enrich.
Because if the Iranian leadership goes on state television and says, we surrender our right to nuclear technology, the hardliners will overthrow the government instantly.
Right. So the solution the report proposes is a concept developed by nuclear expert Mark Goodman called zero-net enrichment.
This concept is the Rosetta Stone for this entire crisis, really, because it perfectly illustrates how physics and diplomacy can intersect to create a compromise.
Break down how zero-net enrichment actually functions, because it sounds like a paradox.
Let's do it. So the U.S. red line is absolute. Iran cannot accumulate a single additional gram of enriched uranium. Iran's red line is equally absolute. They must be allowed to keep their centrifuge machine spinning to prove to their domestic public that they have not surrendered their sovereign rights.
Yeah, those two things seem completely incompatible.
They do, until you apply Goodman's framework. Zero-net enrichment allows Iran to physically operate limited cascades of centrifuges. They are actively enriching small amounts of uranium gas. The scientists are working, the machines are spinning, the electricity is humming.
Okay.
But the framework requires that the moment the enriched output leaves the machine, it is immediately chemically blended back down with depleted uranium, returning it to its natural, unenriched state.
Oh, wow. It's a nuclear treadmill. They are running at full speed doing the work, but they aren't actually traveling anywhere.
That is a perfect way to describe it.
So the Iranian leadership gets to go on state television, point to the spinning centrifuges, and declare to their people, we are still enriching. We stood strong against the West. But the actual usable stockpile of dangerous material doesn't increase by a single ounce, satisfying the U.S. demand of zero new material.
Exactly. It satisfies the core security requirement of the West while fulfilling the domestic political requirement of Tehran. It is a scientifically verifiable, perfectly designed face-saving mechanism.
That is incredibly clever.
You combine zero-net enrichment with the in-place dilution of the existing 440 kilograms of 60% material we discussed earlier, and the verifiable IAEA-monitored closure of the heavily damaged above-ground facilities at Natanz and Fordo, and you suddenly have a functional, viable Phase 2.
Which brings us to the final step, Phase 3, the medium term. This is where you essentially defer all the hardest, most toxic issues into a phased framework with strict conditionality.
Right. Punt them down the road.
Exactly. Instead of fighting over the word reparations today, you slowly release the $6 billion frozen assets into the U.S.-Iran Reconstruction Fund over time, tied to IAEA compliance. Instead of a massive, humiliating military retreat, the U.S. quietly phases down its forward-deployed offensive assets, reclassifying bases to meet the combat forces' withdrawal demand.
Yep.
And you tie any future reductions in Iran's financial funding of proxy networks to the successful implementation of the regional ceasefires.
Phase 3 is an incremental build of trust where absolutely none currently exists. It relies on the understanding that neither side can afford a total victory.
Right.
The report includes a brilliant quote from Trita Parsi of the Quincy Institute that I think summarizes the stark reality facing the American delegation. He said, Trump's failed use of force has blunted the credibility of American military threats. Any agreement will have to rest on genuine compromise. The United States, despite launching 12,300 strikes, is simply not in a position to hand Iran a piece of paper and dictate the terms of surrender. They have to negotiate them.
Because if they don't negotiate them, if they let stubbornness override the mechanics of the deal, that April 29th war powers clock hits zero.
And then everything falls apart.
The American domestic political reality takes the steering wheel, funding gets frozen, and the administration faces an illegal war and a constitutional crisis right as the global economy collapses under $150 oil.
The alternative to compromise is mutual catastrophic failure.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today. Let's trace the arc of what we just explored. We started by looking at the terrifyingly steep cliff of the April 21st ceasefire expiration, backed right up against the legal trap of the April 29th congressional war powers deadline.
Right.
We looked at the maximalist posturing of Iran's 10-point plan versus the U.S. 15-point plan, and how the actual negotiation relies on discrepancies between Farsi and English texts.
We explored the terrifying physical reality of 440 kilograms of invisible, 60% enriched uranium hidden beneath a mountain in Isfahan.
Yeah.
And
it doesn't come down to angry social media posts or grand political speeches. It comes down to the precise legal definition of the phrase combat forces. It comes down to the scientific dilution of invisible nuclear dust in an underground bunker. And it directly dictates whether that $117 barrel of oil spikes further, doubling your grocery bill next month.
It is the meticulous, unglamorous engineering of compromise. But I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over. Something that goes beyond the immediate mechanics of this desperate 13-day window.
Okay, what is it?
History shows us that wars rarely end just because one side wins a decisive, crushing victory. They usually end when exhaustion simply outpaces ambition, when the economic and political cost of the next day of fighting is finally deemed heavier than the bitter cost of a painful compromise.
Right.
But looking at the FFCDR framework, looking at all the clever workarounds, here is the question you have to ask yourself. If this piece relies on hiding enrichment clauses in Farsi, on cleverly rebranding war reparations as a reconstruction fund, on operating centrifuges that don't actually produce anything, and on frantically ignoring a ticking domestic war powers clock, are they actually resolving the underlying conflict? Or are they just meticulously designing the blueprint for the next one?
That is the ultimate diagnostic question. Are we curing the disease or just suppressing the symptoms so we don't have to look at the broken X-ray anymore? Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the headlines, keep looking for the hidden mechanics beneath the rhetoric, and we will see you next time.
Tune in next time on The Valley Current.